What if I told you that envy, the seemingly harmless new emotion in Inside Out 2, is actually the most psychologically dangerous character Pixar has ever created, and I can prove it using 3 disturbing behavioral patterns that reveal why this emotion destroys more lives, relationships, and dreams than any other force in human psychology, because what you're about to discover will forever change how you see that burning feeling in your chest when someone else gets what you want, and by the end of this analysis, you'll understand why envy isn't just Riley's problem, but the hidden puppet master controlling decisions in your own life that you probably don't even realize are happening right now. Here's what makes envy terrifying. Unlike joy, who wants Riley to be happy, or even anger, who wants to protect her, envy doesn't actually want anything good for Riley at all. Instead, she operates on a twisted logic that says Riley can only feel valuable by making others feel less valuable, which is why every single action envy takes in Riley's mind serves one purpose: to convince Riley that her worth depends entirely on comparison, creating a psychological prison where happiness becomes impossible, because there will always be someone who has more, looks better, or achieves greater success. And this isn't just cartoon psychology, this is exactly how envy works in real human minds, which is why that coworker who always tries to one-up your achievements, or that friend who can't celebrate your successes without mentioning their own struggles, or even that voice in your head that whispers you're not good enough when you see someone else's promotion on social media, they're all being controlled by the same psychological mechanism that Pixar brilliantly personified in this deceptively simple green character. But here's where it gets really disturbing, and this is something most people completely miss about envy's true function in Riley's mind. Watch carefully how envy operates, and you'll notice she never actually tries to help Riley get better at anything. She doesn't motivate improvement or encourage growth. Instead, she focuses entirely on diminishing others, spreading rumors, creating social drama, and convincing Riley that the problem isn't her skills or efforts, but rather that other people have unfair advantages. And this psychological pattern reveals something terrifying about how envy functions in adult brains, where it masquerades as justice or fairness, while actually serving as a defense mechanism that protects our ego from the painful reality that maybe, just maybe, we could be trying harder or doing better. Think about your most envious moments and you'll realize they all follow this exact same pattern. Instead of inspiring you to improve, envy convinces you that the game is rigged, that success is about luck or connections or privileges you don't have. And this mental trap keeps millions of people stuck in mediocrity because it's psychologically easier to tear others down than to build yourself up, which is why envy represents one of the most insidious forms of emotional self-sabotage that exists in human psychology. Now, here's what will blow your mind about envy's design and behavior patterns that reveal disturbing truths about how this emotion actually operates in teenage and adult brains. Notice how envy is small and seemingly innocent, almost childlike in her appearance, because this is exactly how envy presents itself in real life, starting as tiny thoughts that seem harmless or even justified, like, why does she get all the attention? Or, he doesn't deserve that promotion. But these seemingly innocent thoughts are actually psychological seeds that grow into massive destructive patterns that can consume entire lives, relationships, and careers if left unchecked. Envy's voice is whiny and petulant, never confident or strong, because real envy always comes from a place of perceived weakness and inadequacy, which is why people who seem the most successful on the outside can be the most envious on the inside, constantly comparing themselves to others and never feeling satisfied with their own achievements, because envy has convinced them that their worth is entirely relative to other people's failures or successes. And this connects to something even more disturbing about how envy interacts with Riley's other emotions, particularly how she manipulates sadness, joy, and even anger to serve her agenda. Because in real human psychology, envy rarely works alone. Instead, it hijacks other emotional systems to disguise its true nature, making you feel sad about your own life, angry at unfair circumstances, or even falsely joyful when others fail, which is why that weird feeling of satisfaction you get when someone you're jealous of experiences. A setback isn't actually happiness, it's envy celebrating a temporary victory in the comparison game that keeps your mind trapped in a cycle of measuring your worth against other people's perceived successes or failures. But the most shocking aspect of envy's psychological profile, and this is something that will completely change how you see this emotion in your own life, is how she creates what psychologists call compare and despair cycles that literally literally rewire the brain's reward system to find pleasure in other people's pain rather than in personal growth or achievement. Watch how envy reacts when Riley succeeds at something versus when she sees others fail, and you'll notice a disturbing pattern. Genuine personal success barely registers as satisfying, but other people's struggles or failures create intense emotional rewards, which explains why social media has become such a breeding ground for envious behavior, because platforms like Instagram and Facebook provide endless opportunities for comparison and the dopamine hits that come from feeling superior to others, even temporarily. This psychological rewiring is why people can achieve everything they once thought they wanted: the house, the job, the relationship, the body, and still feel miserable and unfulfilled, because envy has trained their brain to measure satisfaction not by their own progress or happiness, but by how they stack up against everyone else, creating a moving target that can never actually be reached because there will always be someone with more money, better looks, higher status, or greater achievements. And this is where envy's true sadness becomes apparent, because she condemns Riley and anyone controlled by this emotion to a life where contentment becomes impossible, where every joy is poisoned by comparison, and where personal growth stops because all energy gets redirected toward monitoring and resenting other people's success instead of building your own. Here's the part that will disturb you most about envy's role in Inside Out 2, and what it reveals about the psychology of comparison in modern adult life. Envy doesn't just want Riley to feel bad about herself. She actively works to sabotage Riley's relationships, because envy understands that genuine human connection is the antidote to comparison-based thinking. So she plants seeds of suspicion, encourages gossip, and creates social drama that isolates Riley from the very people who could help her develop a healthier sense of self-worth. This is exactly what happens in adult friendships, romantic relationships, and workplace dynamics where envy takes root. Suddenly you find yourself keeping score of who does more, who gets more attention, who has it easier, and these mental calculations slowly poison the trust and intimacy that relationships require to thrive, which is why many marriages and friendships that seem perfect from the outside are actually battlegrounds of petty competitions and resentments that neither person wants to acknowledge or address. Think about that friend who can't celebrate your good news without immediately shifting the conversation to their own struggles, or that romantic partner who keeps track of every perceived inequity in the relationship, or that family member who turns every gathering into an opportunity to compare achievements, careers, or life choices. They're all being controlled by the same psychological force that drives envy's behavior in Riley's mind: the desperate need to feel valuable through comparison rather than through genuine self-acceptance and personal growth. And this comparison trap becomes even more destructive in the age of social media, where everyone's highlight reel becomes the standard against which we measure our behind-the-scenes reality, creating a psychological environment where envy can flourish because we're constantly exposed to carefully curated versions of other people's lives that trigger our deepest insecurities about our own worth and progress. But here's what makes envy's sadness even more profound and heartbreaking. She genuinely believes she's protecting Riley from disappointment and rejection by lowering her expectations and convincing her that other people's success proves her own inadequacy, because in envy's twisted logic, it's safer to assume you can't have something than to risk trying and failing, which is why envy often disguises itself as realism or practicality when it's actually just fear masquerading as wisdom. This psychological defense mechanism explains why so many adults abandoned their dreams not because they tried and failed, but because they convinced themselves that success only happens to other people who have advantages, connections, or luck that they lack. And this learned helplessness becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that keeps people trapped in situations they complain about, but never actually work to change, because envy has convinced them that effort is pointless and improvement is impossible. The most devastating aspect of envy's influence is how she destroys the very motivation needed for personal growth by making every achievement feel meaningless unless it surpasses someone else's accomplishments, which means that even genuine progress gets dismissed or minimized if it doesn't result in relative superiority, creating a psychological environment where learning, creativity, and self-improvement become impossible because they're all filtered through the question of whether they make you better than others rather than better than you were before. Now, here's the mind-blowing revelation that will forever change how you see envy and the role of comparison in human psychology. Envy's true function isn't actually to make Riley feel bad about herself. That's just the surface-level manifestation of a much deeper and more disturbing psychological process process that reveals something fundamental about how human brains process social information and construct identity in group settings. Envy exists because humans evolved in small tribes where social status directly determined survival and reproductive success. So our brains develop sophisticated comparison mechanisms to constantly monitor where we stand relative to others in our social group, and these ancient psychological programs are still running in our modern minds, even though the social contexts have completely changed, which is why we feel genuine physical stress when someone else gets promoted, why we experience real emotional pain when friends succeed in areas where we struggle, and why social media can trigger the same fight or flight responses that our ancestors felt when facing actual threats to their survival and status. This evolutionary perspective reveals that envy isn't just a character flaw or negative emotion. She's actually a primitive survival mechanism that helped our ancestors navigate complex social hierarchies. But in modern contexts where basic survival is rarely at stake, these comparison instincts become destructive rather than protective, creating artificial competition where cooperation would be more beneficial and generating chronic stress about relative status that has no actual bearing on our security, happiness, or well-being. Understanding this evolutionary function explains why envy feels so compelling and justified even when we know intellectually that comparison is pointless, because she's activating ancient neural pathways that evolved to keep us alive in environments where social rejection could literally mean death. And these primitive alarm systems don't distinguish between actual threats and perceived slights, treating a coworker's promotion or a friend's vacation photos as existential challenges that require immediate emotional and behavioral responses. The ultimate tragedy of Envy's character, and what makes her the saddest emotion in Inside Out 2, is that she traps Riley in a psychological prison where happiness becomes impossible because it's always conditional on other people's failures or disappointments, creating a worldview where joy can only exist through comparison rather than through genuine appreciation for life's experiences, relationships, and personal growth. This comparison-based approach to happiness explains why people can achieve extraordinary success by any objective measure and still feel miserable and unfulfilled, because envy has convinced them that their achievements only matter if they exceed someone else's accomplishments, which means that satisfaction becomes dependent on factors completely outside their control, like other people's choices, opportunities, and outcomes, rather than on their own values, progress, and experiences. And this external locus of control creates a life of constant anxiety and resentment where personal peace becomes impossible because it requires monitoring and judging everyone else's lives instead of focusing on building a meaningful and satisfying existence based on your own priorities and values. The final revelation about envy that will change everything you think you know about this emotion and its role in human psychology is that she actually represents a profound misunderstanding of how value and worth work in reality, because she operates on the false premise that there's a limited amount of success, happiness, or love available in the world, so other people's gains automatically mean your losses, when the truth is that most valuable things in life, like creativity, love, knowledge, and personal growth, actually expand when shared rather than diminish, which means that other people's success often creates more opportunities rather than fewer, and their happiness can inspire and elevate rather than threaten and diminish. This scarcity mindset that envy promotes is not only psychologically destructive, but also factually incorrect in most modern contexts where collaboration and mutual support create better outcomes than competition and comparison, which is why the most successful and satisfied people tend to be those who celebrate others' achievements, support their friends' dreams, and measure their progress against their own past rather than against other people's present, creating positive feedback loops that generate more success, deeper relationships, and genuine contentment rather than the hollow victories and temporary satisfactions that come from feeling superior to others. The real sadness of envy isn't just what she does to Riley's happiness in the moment, but how she programs Riley's mind to find meaning through comparison rather than through contribution, satisfaction through superiority rather than through growth, and identity through relative status rather than through authentic self-expression, creating a psychological foundation that will make genuine fulfillment nearly impossible unless Riley learns to recognize envy's influence and consciously choose different ways of thinking about herself, her relationships, and her place in the world, which is exactly the challenge that every adult faces when they realize that the comparison game they've been playing is rigged against happiness and decide to create their own definition of success based on their values rather than their ranking relative to everyone else they know.